Hello folks. In this video I'm going to continue talking about the basics of shooting pictures in manual mode with your digital camera. In this part I'll be talking about aperture. Aperture is a variable sized opening in the lens. The smaller the number, the larger the opening. The larger the number, the smaller the opening. The larger this opening or aperture is, the more light is let through and the brighter the image will be, all else being equal. The aperture range available to you will vary with the lens. Generally, higher quality lenses will have larger maximum apertures, so they allow for more light. Zoom lenses often have an aperture that varies depending on the zoom level. The maximum aperture at the widest zoom setting is often larger than the maximum aperture at the longest telephoto setting of a zoom lens. High-end zoom lenses often have the same maximum aperture available at all focal lengths. If you're trying to get more light in a picture without having to slow the shutter speed to the point that you get image blur, you might try setting the aperture larger. If your scene is too bright and you have to use a super fast shutter speed, you can try to reduce the light by making the aperture smaller. As with the shutter speed, the aperture setting doesn't only affect the lighting of the image. The aperture also affects the depth of field. When a lens focuses, it only focuses at a particular distance. A smaller depth of field means that a smaller range of distance will be in focus at once. A larger depth of field means that a larger range of distance will be in focus at once. For example, imagine you focus on a subject 30 inches from the front of the lens. A large or wide depth of field may mean that everything between 20 and 40 inches distance from the lens is in good focus. Objects closer or further than that will gradually blur until they are totally out of focus. A narrow depth of field may mean that only objects between 29 to 31 inches from the lens are in focus, and everything else begins to quickly blur. Depending on the lens and camera design, you may not be able to get that narrow of a depth of field, but the aperture is how you adjust the depth of field. Also, the further away the focus point is from the lens, the wider the depth of field will be at a given aperture. So if you focus on something close to the lens, the depth of field may be an inch or less. But if you leave the aperture the same and instead focus on something 100 feet away, the depth of field will be much larger. Opening the aperture wider will reduce the depth of field, and closing the aperture down will increase the depth of field. A narrow depth of field can allow for some artistic perspective and can blur foreground and background objects to help draw attention to a subject. But it can also make it difficult to get your entire scene or subject in focus. A narrow depth of field can also make it difficult to achieve perfect focus on your subject, since only a small distance range of the image is in focus at once. A wide aperture like f1.8 can allow for higher shutter speeds and poor light, and can give the effect of everything but the subject satisfyingly blurred. But it also gives a really narrow depth of field. If you're taking a picture of two subjects, and one is even a little bit further away from the lens than the other, it may be difficult to get them both in focus at once if you have a very narrow depth of field. A smaller aperture will give a larger depth of field, and may allow for a large, complex scene to be in focus simultaneously. Test out different aperture settings and get a feel for how the adjustment changes your images. Shutter speed and aperture adjustments work hand in hand to achieve proper exposure. If you're going for a certain shutter speed to get a certain look, or to prevent or achieve motion blur, you may have to adjust aperture to compensate for exposure. Likewise, if you adjust aperture to get a specific depth of field, you may have to adjust the shutter speed to get the exposure you want. At times, you may be able to set the aperture at a certain level and leave it there for a day of shooting. Adjusting the shutter speed may be enough to get proper exposure, allowing you to leave the aperture setting alone. In other words, you won't necessarily have to adjust the aperture all that often, but knowing how it affects the image will help you know what to adjust to get the pictures you want. There is more to aperture. It can sometimes have an effect on image clarity, color fringing, and more. And if you want to really delve deep, there's a lot of information out there, but this video is just about the basics. Exposure and depth of field are the two main aspects of the aperture setting that you want to have a basic understanding of in order to begin shooting in manual mode. Thank you for watching. Take care.